Hey guys, this is Fidel Master Michel. The middle game is an extremely important phase of the game. Notice the outcome of most games is decided in the middle game. Very often, the goal in this phase is to get material or positional advantage to get into the endgame. In the opening, there are opening principles. They have been stated and it's more or less simple to follow and apply them. In the endgame, there are methods to play basically any position with few pieces, and also many games don't even get the endgame. However, there is so much content about the middle game, there are so many rules, principles, ideas, strategy, tactics. In this video, I will show you the 15 most important middle game principles. And the first principle is, if there is an attack on a wing of the board, you need to react in the center. Let's analyze this example. In this position, black has been advancing the pawns on the king side and they are clearly preparing some kind of attack over there. The queen and bishop are targeting this side of the board. Also the rook is very well once they play h4 and they open, so the knights are fine, and also the bishop is looking at the king side, so there is a clear intention here of an attack on the king side, so we should react in the center. The best move for white in this position is going to be d4, reacting over there, breaking the center. When we play d4, we are trying to open the d5, but also we are trying to open the great diagonal, and then we are creating some distraction on the board, so the attack on the king side cannot continue. The next principle is, do not trade pieces when you have space advantage. The idea of this rule is that when you have more space, your pieces can move all over the board, you can maneuver, and you can try to find the best squares on the board for your pieces. However, when we analyze our opponent's pieces, they don't have so much space, and very often his pieces will be blocking each other. So if we keep them with a lot of pieces, of course it's going to be harder for him to handle everything with so many pieces and such a short space. So when we analyze this example, here it is white to move. The best move for white in this position is going to be the surprising and strong knight b3. The idea of this move is that, observe that now black has some problems with the minor pieces blocking the bishop. Observe the difference. If we trade here, then black is just going to be improving pieces and they don't have any piece blocking another. So after knight b3 we go back, but we keep a lot of problems in the position for black. Principle number 3 is keep a healthy pawn structure. Let's analyze this example here. Let's assume this is a middle game, but we're just going to focus on the pawn structure. When we look at black's pawn structure, we can see that they have a really good pawn structure, and when we analyze white's pawn structure, we can find some weaknesses. So, for example, this pawn on a3 is an isolated pawn. It is disconnected from other pawns. Also, we can see here doubled and at the same time isolated pawns on the c file. And if we continue analyzing, we can find that e3 is a backward pawn. It's a pawn left behind. So again, it's a weakness. It cannot be protected by other pawns. But also the square in front of the backward pawn is going to be a weakness. Also, we should mention that the pawn on h3 is isolated, and another thing we need to analyze when we are talking about pawn structure is the number of pawn islands. In this position, white has 1, 2, 3, and 4 pawn islands. That's not good. However, when we analyze black's position, we can see that they have 1 pawn island over here and another over here, so only 2 pawn islands. So again, black's structure is much better. The next principle is don't move pawns without a good reason to do it. We are going to use the same structure to understand this principle, and let's assume we move the pawn to h4, and what happens here is that, observe that every time we move a pawn, we are going to create weaknesses. We are going to stop controlling some square. Also, the more advanced pawns are, the weaker they are. So the main problem is that when we move pawns, we are weakening both squares around the pawn and the pawn itself. Also observe that the pawn is the only piece that cannot move back. So let's say we play something dubious with the bishop. Okay, then we can just go back and try to fix it in the next move, and we cannot do the same thing with the pawn. So every pawn move should be thoroughly thought before we play it on the board. Principle number 5 is spot and attack weaknesses. If your opponent has a weakness but you don't attack it, you don't put pressure on that weakness, then the weakness is not really a problem for him. However, if he has a weakness and you start attacking those weaknesses, let's assume this position here where let's assume we are playing as black, and let's focus on this pawn here on e3. If we attack it very strongly, very often we will be able to take it, but even if we don't, the fact that our pieces are active, attacking that pawn over the diagonal and over the file, and he has to be defending with pieces, like very passively defending over there, it means a lot, because it means that our pieces are active and his pieces are passive. Even if in the end we cannot capture the pawn, maybe we can use our activity to get the advantage over some other side of the board. The next one is put your rook in open and half open files. The rooks are very powerful pieces, we need to use them properly, and the way to do that is by using open, like the E file, or half open, like the C file. If you do this, your rooks are going to be very active. Sometimes you can put pressure on some targets, or sometimes you can just threaten to get some important rank by infiltrating on your opponent's position. The 7th principle is understand and apply simplification. The idea here is that when you have some material advantage, you need to trade pieces, because even if the material advantage is the smallest one we can have, which is a pawn up, we are going to be able to win the endgame almost always if we trade pieces. For example, in this position, there are many pieces on the board, but if by some way we can start trading and get rid of all of them, we are going to have a pawn endgame with a pawn up. So for example, let's assume all these pieces are not on the board, then we just have a pawn endgame with an outside passed pawn here for white, and this is going to be an easy win for them. So the idea is that whenever you have some material advantage, even if it is the smallest material advantage, one pawn up, you can start trading pieces, and in general this is going to be a win for you if you can actually achieve that goal. Also, if you have a material disadvantage, you need to do the opposite. Avoid trades, because if you simplify, you're going to lose in the endgame. And also you should try to keep the tension on the board and try to keep the position as unclear as possible. And the next one is trade pieces to stop the enemy attack. We have this example where it is white to move. Black is threatening checkmate here on g2, and we should try to defend here. Of course, we have many options, but the best move here is going to be just bishop d5. When we play this move, we are trading pieces. In this case, the bishop is very active, it's very aggressive, it's helping. The queen is connected with the queen, creating many threats over there, and by trading some pieces, the attack is going to be over. Observe that after bishop d5, if there is a trade here, which is probably the best move Black can play, then the attack is totally over. There is nothing. This is a totally normal middle game position. Principle number 9 is don't be crazy, but be aggressive. The first world champion, Steinitz, said, "The player with an advantage must attack, otherwise his advantage will evaporate." There is this interesting example. In this position, we can see that white has a very clear space advantage. Black has some weaknesses on the king side. Also, the king is very discovered with some open lines over there. And black pieces are in bad position as they don't have a space to move. They are really passive over there. In a situation like this, we need to be aggressive. We need to play actively and try to take advantage of our better position. The right move here is going to be knight h4, and the idea is that we are clearing the line for the queen, but also we are going to this weak square f5. Observe that our opponent cannot control that square with pawns, so that's a really nice square for our pieces, and the knight is going to create a lot of damage from f5 because it's going to be controlling g7 and h6 squares really close to the enemy king. So that's what we are planning, improving the knight, improving the queen. Also we are improving the rooks, for example, after f4, and the attack is going to be very clear. So if you have the advantage in your games, try to use it, be aggressive, because if you don't, it will evaporate. The 10th principle is rooks can lift over the third rank. We already mentioned earlier that the rooks are very powerful pieces, and of course if we are attacking on the king side, maybe we want to involve our rooks in that attack. So something we can do, and it's a very typical middle game maneuver when we want to use the rook in the attack, is to lift the rook over the third rank. In this position we have this idea of knight h4 as we were saying, and after f4 we could use the plan rook f3, and then we are lifting the rook over that rank. But even more interesting is that we can do the same thing with the rook from the queen side. Observe, the third rank is totally clear, so we can play rook a3 and rook g3 or a3, and the rook is going to be a really powerful piece in the attack. It's going to create a lot of damage on black's structure. The next one is capture towards the center. In general, when we have two options to capture with two different pawns, the right way to capture is going to be towards the center. Like for example in this position, a takes b3 should be the right move. Observe that if we capture with the c pawn, we are going to stop controlling key squares. The pawn is getting away from the center, and the center is a very important area of the board. However, if we capture with this pawn, then we keep both pawns controlling central squares, and that's what we really need. So in general, the right way to capture is towards the center. Principle number 12 is appreciate the two bishops. Some master said once the two bishops are worth 7 points in open positions. So just to make this clearer, if you are playing some middle game and you have two bishops and they are in good diagonals, really active, you can have one pawn down and you will have a very good compensation for that pawn, because the bishops are around 7 points in open positions. Observe, they don't necessarily have to be targeting the king. It can be hard to understand how to convert this strategical advantage in a real game, but a way to estimate the advantage of the two bishops is by observing that they are controlling more squares. So try to keep them, try to stay with the two bishops, because if you do that, you're going to control more squares than your opponent. So of course it's going to be good for you, and of course it's going to be an advantage for you. And the next one is keep the knights in closed positions, keep the bishops in the open ones. So just to show you what this means, let's analyze this position. Here it is white to move, and I'm going to show you two different lines. So the first line is when white plays c5 here, and then we can see that the position is going to be totally closed or blocked, and in this kind of positions the knights are going to be much better. Observe, the knight can maneuver, like going to e5, the other knight can also go to g5, and at some point, for example, we can talk about knight d2, knight b3, knight a5, because, well, I'm assuming black is playing b5 here. So the idea here is that the knights can maneuver. Same thing for black knight. For example, this knight can go to c4 or to e4, or the other knight can go to f6 and try to get e4 anyways. So there are many options because the knights can jump among the pawns. Observe that trading a knight, for example, on a5 for that bishop on b7 is going to be a very bad trade, because the bishop is a very bad piece in that position, as the knight can create some ideas in blocked positions. The other line is when we don't block and we play something normal, like let's say rook c1, black takes the pawn on c4, bishop takes c4, and then a break here on c5. That might be a trade, and then there might be another trade on c5. So let's analyze this position now. Observe, we just played like 3 or 4 moves on the board, and this is totally different. Here the bishops have long diagonals with a lot of pressure. Same thing for black bishops. In these kind of situations, the bishops are much better than knights. So in general, we don't want to trade our bishops for our enemy knights in these positions. 14th principle is keep your queen away from open and half open files. And for this one, we're assuming rooks are still on the board. The thing is that when the rooks are on the board, the queen can be exposed in open or half open files. Just to see an example about this, in this position, if white plays queen c2, it looks like a really nice position for the queen. It's connected with the bishop. However, it's not so great. This is a half open file here for black, and when they play rook c8, we're going to be in trouble here. Observe, they are pinning that pawn on c3, so black could be threatening knight takes d4 or knight b4, trying to trade our bishop for his knight. So in general, the queen is not fine here in a half open file. And the other example is when we play, for example, this is an open file, so when we play queen e2, trying to control that open file, that looks perfect for white. We're controlling many squares, the queen is active. However, black is going to play rook e8, and then the queen is exposed, and we will have to move the queen. We are wasting a tempo here, and in the end, black is the one actually improving his position. And finally, this principle also essential, and it is keep your king safe and make sure you're not moving the pawns in front of your king. The idea here is that the best position for your pawns next to your king is going to be right in front of the king, right in the base. So just like we have here, f2, g2, and h2, that's the best position, that's the safest structure for our pawns. Once we start moving, we are going to be creating weaknesses. Just to show you what this means, this example is a little chaotic because what is going to happen here is actually surprising. As long as we have the pawns in the base, our king is going to be really well, very safe. There won't be any real problem. But if we move one of those pawns, black is going to be winning almost immediately. So, for example, if we play a3 here, that looks like a normal move. Anyone could play that just to control g4, just to clear some square for the king. Well, in this position, we are weakening this square, g3, very much. And this is going to be decisive. Here, black can play knight f4. They are threatening checkmate here on g2. And white doesn't have a good way to stop that threat. For example, they cannot move the pawn to defend over the rank because there is a pin. But also they cannot move the pawn to g3 because there could be a capture on g3, and that's also winning. g4 looks like an option, but actually after queen h6, black is taking the pawn, mating again, but also they are discovering and getting the queen over here, so g4 doesn't solve the problem either. So the main idea is that after this a3, white is totally lost. Let's analyze what can happen if they move another pawn, the g pawn. Well, again, this is winning for black. We have this line starting with a sacrifice, and it's going to be actually a really nice demolition combination. Here we can play knight takes g3. We are taking advantage of the pin of that bishop on the pawn on f2. So knight takes g3, and after h takes g3, queen takes g3 check. The idea here is that the king doesn't have protection. These files are now open for the king. So at some point we are going to lift the rook, by the way, over the third rank for black, and it's going to be winning for them. So once the king goes to h1, the queen is hanging, so we need to give a check first. And then this is the right moment to lift the rook. So rook e6, and this is just winning for black. So one more time, let's take a look at the position. One simple pawn move like a3 or g3 can destroy our position, and we can be lost because of that. Instead of a pawn move, something better could be like knight e2, bringing pieces to the king side to protect the king a little better, and the position is going to be very playable. Maybe very slightly better for black, but nothing more than that, just a very normal middle game position. So You know, in general we need to keep our king safe, and a good way to do that is to keep our pawns on the base. Once we move them, we are creating weaknesses, and in general we need to avoid that. If you guys have any question, let me know in the comments. If you want to learn how to make plans in the middle game, check out this interesting video. It's a tutorial with many amazing examples. I'm sure you will enjoy it and it will help you a lot. Thank you so much guys. Like, subscribe. See you on the next.